There was a time in American culture, at least during the first half of our nation's story, that the calling to be a minister or missionary was ranked at the top of desirable professions, right up there with becoming a lawyer or doctor. But for a host of reasons, most parents don't celebrate the news that their child is giving up a promising future to pursue the pastorate. But tonight, we'll talk to a pair of seasoned missionaries, a couple who somehow tuned out the distraction of material success to find joy in a life of service. And we'll ask them how to recognize a calling in your own life. I know you'll be encouraged. Stay with us. It's been over 50 years now since David Cross and his wife Barbara were captivated by stories of missionary work to the Aboriginals of Australia. Their decision to say yes led them through decades of church planting adventures in the land down under, in the UK, and then ministering back home in the United States. Their life wasn't a straight line, though, but one that zigzagged through opportunities and obstacles that led them to simply trust God, to know His voice, to know that when He said it was time to move, they could just say yes. Tonight, from their cottage in Quarryville, Pennsylvania, Pastor David and Barbara Cross, mentors to a generation of men and women who are serving God around the world, and people I think you'll enjoy getting to know better. David and Barbara, welcome to State of Independence. So delighted to see you. Take us back to that decision of pulling up your roots and accepting a call to the Aboriginal people. Why did you do it? Why did you say yes? And how old were you when you did this?
Well, there are several parts to that, Joe. Barbara wanted to be a missionary from the time she was 4 years old. Maybe she should tell you that.
I was brought up by a very godly, mission-minded family, my aunt and uncle. And so I grew up knowing that missionaries were my heroes. And when I was 4 years old, they tell the story that someone came and spoke in the church about being missionaries to the American Indians. And I went up to this missionary and I said, I want to be a missionary. And he sort of patted me on the head and said, oh, that's nice, little girl. And I started crying and he said, what's wrong? And I said, but who's going to tell them about Jesus until I'm big? And so I had a heart for mission from the time I was 4, and that has never changed in my whole life.
That's wonderful. Where are you all both from?
Well, I'm from Pennsylvania. I was born in the Scranton area and grew up there until I went to college. But Barbara's story is a little different.
Well, I was born in California, had the sense to leave there when I was 18 months old, and moved to the state of Washington, and I was there till I was about 9. Then I lived for a year in Arkansas, and then I figured Joplin, Missouri was my home. So I'm a Midwesterner.
Wow, that's great. That's great. Where'd you go to college? Did you all meet in college, or tell me how you all met?
Yes, we met in college at what is now Columbia International University in South Carolina. It's a very missions-minded school, so we had missions in front of us day in and day out at Columbia. But I grew up in a family that was Christian. My father was converted under the ministry of Billy Sunday.
Oh, Billy Sunday, so, yeah, famed evangelist,
yes. Yeah. Well, I'm next to the youngest of 11 children, and my oldest brother was 26 years older than I am, and he was a missionary in South America. When I first knew I had an oldest brother, he was already in Bolivia. And so missions was something that was always there, but 3 of my 7 brothers were already preachers, and I thought that was enough. I wanted to be a farmer. However, when I was in high school, I began taking voice lessons. And as I was studying voice and listening to preachers at Youth for Christ, I kept facing the question, what are you going to do with the gift God has given you? You're just going to sing to the cows? And so I wound up going to Columbia. And of course, the rest is history.
That's great. So so you end up going to Australia. How old were you all when you first went to Australia?
28. Well, we were a couple of weeks from being 28.
Wow.
Both of us were only 5 days apart in age.
Wow.
And so I was in seminary my first year, and a guest speaker came and told about their mission and the work that they had just taken over from an Australian woman among the Aboriginal people in Southwest Australia. The tribal name in that area is Noongar, and it takes a while to get to be able to say that word. But anyway, she wanted to retire and was looking for someone. Took 5 years before we actually got there, but we went in 1970, and we were there until 1981.
Joe, maybe the Lord gave me a little premonition that we were going to go there. When I was in Southern Baptist Church in Missouri, we had a Sunday school quarterly, as they did, came out, and it had this picture of the dawn and the ducks flying, and underneath was a verse: "If I take the wings of the morning and go to the uttermost parts of the sea, there your hand will guide me." I'm just giving a loose translation of that. But I tore off that paper and I kept it. And sure enough, I went to the uttermost parts of the sea halfway around the world. But, so maybe that was it really impressed me that that's what God wanted me to do. And I was only in high school at that time.
Wow.
That's right. Southwestern Australia is exactly halfway around the world from Philadelphia.
Oh my goodness, that must have been so different from what you had. And were you in the wild? I mean, in the bush, or because it didn't sound like you were. Were you in one of the big cities there, or?
Okay. When we first arrived, we went to a small town called Brookton, and our work was exclusively with the Noongar folk that lived in that area. But then we moved into the city of Perth, and we worked in the general population. In fact, the first church we started, at one point, I had the chairman of the Department of Economics from the University of Western Australia sitting in one row, and an Aboriginal woman that could neither read nor write in the row behind him.
Joe, in answer to your question, the people we worked with were usually farm workers, sheep shearers, worked in the wheat fields. So they were, and the language was dying out amongst them. So we learned some words, but even they didn't know a whole lot of the language.
Wow.
It was dying out.
Wow. Was the teaching, was the gospel completely foreign to them as well? I mean, were they at all aware of the gospel of Jesus Christ? Had they heard of that? And did they?
Yes. A lot of them had heard. Miss Jones, whose work we went to take over, had done a wonderful work. She had preached the gospel, taught the gospel, demonstrated the gospel in the way she helped people and worked with people of every age. She was like a mother. But of course, like a mother, sometimes she couldn't let go, and that created a certain problem with the transition. But as a result, we wound up in the city of Perth, and were able to start 3 churches there. Those 3 churches are still going and growing, and
we also continued to work along with that of going to the Brookton, driving 90 miles outside of Perth to minister to the people on Sunday and in the middle of the week. So we were doing both kinds of work there.
How did you continue to, I mean, how did you not give up? I mean, when you consider the fact that, one, you're halfway around the world from your family, so it's not like you're going to go home 3 or 4 times a year. I mean, were you able to get back home at all, like in a year, or was it years before you came back?
Go ahead.
No, we were there 4 years. And even in those days, there was no FaceTime, no Skype, anything like that. A letter took 14 days. And we made one 3-minute phone call in that 4 years, and we had to think hard about it because it was so expensive. But it was my mother-in-law's 75th birthday, and so we bit the bullet and called her.
Wow. Wow. So
we had no helpers either. We were there on our own.
So you're there on your own. You're halfway around the world. You know you're not going to see your family. I'm just thinking about people who are watching now who might say to themselves, like initially they might say, well, that's really cool. It'd be really cool to be a missionary. But then when they realize that they might be halfway around the world, if that's where God sends you, and maybe without all the creature comforts that you're normally accustomed to. I'm guessing that all the stuff that you were accustomed to may not have been so readily available, especially outside of the city of Perth.
That's right. That's right. They were, in those days, Australia was quite a bit behind with appliances and such. Not true today, but in those days it was. And it was hard sometimes, missing family. We did have 2 little girls, and that was a help. But, we knew God had called us there. And neither one got discouraged on the same day.
That's a blessing. Did your little girls end up picking up Australian accents when they were small?
Oh yes, oh yes, very strong ones.
But it must not have been too bad for them. They both came back and both went to Colombia and met their husbands there. And the older one has been in missions in Europe now for 30 years with her husband. And the younger one, her husband was called to the 3rd church we planted. So that church just hired him, called him, moved him to Australia 20 years ago, a little over 20 years.
So she's back in Australia.
Yes.
Wow. Has her accent reemerged?
No, she lost it in America. I mean, people here think she has one, but we know she's lost most of it.
Yeah. Now, were they with you in England also? Because you've been in Australia and then also England. Where are the places you've been?
Well, after in 1981, we left Australia. We believed it was the right time to get out of the way and let Australians do the job, and came back to Pennsylvania, and I was asked to be the organizing pastor for a new church in Carlisle. And so we were in Carlisle then at that church for 9 years, and then raised support to go to England. We were invited to England by a group that wanted someone that had experience in planting new churches. And that's
where Barbara learned how to make her tea. Is that what it is?
Well, we did learn a lot about making tea in Australia. We boil the billy, as the Aussies would say, and make our tea. Barbara, as she said already, always wanted to be a missionary, and she wanted to go back to the mission field. But you can tell that story.
Well, I loved Carlisle and the people we had there. They were wonderful. But every time I heard a mission message, my heart was so gripped, and I kept saying, David, our girls are married. They finished their education. We could go back to the mission field. And he said to me, if the Lord wants me on the mission field again, somebody is going to have to call me. Well, I knew that was a signal. I better shut up. I couldn't call it myself.
So what happened?
Well, you tell.
So one day I went to the mailbox and I took out this letter. It was from a fellow who had done some work with us in Australia, an American, but he was in London at the time, and he said, we're talking about planting churches. And he said, we were wondering if the Cross Duo would come. Use the word duo.
Yeah.
And so Barbara said, now what are you going to do?
Yeah. That's how the Lord works.
Yeah. Yes. So I said, well, I guess I have to investigate, because this is what I said if somebody invited me. And I went over and talked with a couple of different leaders, and I came back and Barbara said, well, what did you think? And I said, well, they need help, and I don't see anybody else offering to do it. So I guess we ought to apply. And one thing led to another, and
We had 20 wonderful years there. Loved the
Really?
people. Uh, it was a different culture than Australia, obviously,
Yeah.
a different culture than
mhm.
America. So we had to learn. We had to learn We had to learn a new English language.
Yeah.
We speak three English
That's right.
languages.
The Australian, British English, and American English. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
And Aussie English is different as well.
yeah.
So, but we loved being in England, and we love being in Australia. We love being in America. That's our. I'll be glad when we get to heaven and we'll revisit all those places in the Lord's time.
Yeah. Well, what's the biggest challenge, as you look at it? I mean, each place is different, but at the end of the day, is there a sameness about human beings no matter where you are, like whether you're in Australia or in England or in the U.S.? Is there a sameness about the hunger that people have to know the Lord, or about the problems that they have, or do you find it that people are very, very different in these different places?
Well, I think that there's a difference between what it was like in 1970 when we went to Australia and what it was like in 2011 when we came back from England. You know that a lot of changes have happened in the United States over that time, but it also is true in these other countries. In Australia, when we went out there, a lot of people had some connection with church, and if you started a new church in a new part of town, you had an opportunity to just invite people, and some would come. It wasn't that way in England. As one of my Anglican church friends said, in this country, you'll find that everybody, any place you go, you're on somebody else's patch. In other words, the whole country's been divided up into parishes, and somebody is responsible for the spiritual life from the Church of England in every part of the country. And yet, it's the church that people don't go to. So a lot of what we found was that when you'd start to talk about something Christian, the kind of shutters would come down, and they wouldn't argue with you. They just stop talking until you change the subject, and that was pretty difficult.
It's like I remember going to a hairdresser and trying to engage her in the gospel, and I said to her, "What do young people your age think about God?" And she looked at me and she says, "We don't think about God at all." And that
Wow.
really represented what we were facing. It wasn't just young people, but particularly young people had completely turned off.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's just incredible to hear, and it's a blessing that God chose you, the two of you, to be there with the hearts that you have for the Lord, and with the experience that you've had both in the United States and in Australia, to go to the mission field in England. Most people would suppose, well, England, that must have been a piece of cake, but when you hear that, that people would make that kind of a response, we don't think about God at all. That's like incredible.
Yes.
One thing that did help us was we started a ministry called Divorce Care. And we found that when people were going through very painful divorces, they would come to our home and go through that. And we had the chance for the gospel to be presented. We had the chance to show Christian love and compassion for what they were doing. And that was probably one of the best places to speak to people about the Lord, where they were so desperate for emotional help,
Yeah.
if some spiritual help.
Yeah.
So that was a way to find a need that they had.
Yeah.
Was a good way.
Well, David and Barbara Cross, it's been a joy to meet both of you. I can't wait to meet you in person, but also to hear about how God has used you to be his hands and feet to so many people. I know the book isn't closed on your ministry, so we'll be looking for updates about the ways God continues to use each of you. Thanks so much for being guests on State of Independence.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure.
When we return, the president and CEO of Quarryville Presbyterian Retirement Community, Robert Hayward, my good friend, is going to be with us. Stay with us.
Learn more about Joe Watkins and the mission of this program at joewatkins.net. And tell Joe what you thought about today's program in the comment box.
Well, we've had Robert on the program several times, and we do it for a reason, to remind those of you who might be in the fourth quarter of life that God has a mission that won't be completed until the day he calls you home. Few people say it more clearly than Robert Hayward. Welcome back, Robert.
Oh, Joe, great to be back with you again.
Yeah, it's always great to have you here. We have so much fun together.
Yes, indeed.
I was just saying to you that Stephanie and I want to come visit you at Quarryville.
We'd love to have you both.
We want to meet
Yes.
a number of the people that live there have written to us and have been faithful viewers of State of Independence on Lighthouse TV. And
we'd welcome you with open arms.
That's so nice.
And good food and candy as well.
That's even better. The good food part is.
Yep.
So yeah, I look forward to meeting the Crosses in person. It's amazing how God uses people, and it's the two of them together. Because
Isn't it?
You remember he was saying that when they got the call to go to England,
Yes.
they said the duo, both of you,
Yes.
both you and your spouse.
Yeah. Oh, that story was fascinating, and the way you drew it out of them with the fact that they both, in their own way, felt a call from the Lord, and then together they were called, and then God used their gifts in specific ways, each bouncing off the other to do great ministries, and they're still passionate about doing what God has called them to do, which is fun to see.
Yeah.
It's they're living out His story through their story.
How do so as people get older, we have a number of people who watch this show who they range in age from young to people who are seniors. So if you happen to be a senior, I mean, how do you, because you know how seniors are. I mean, there's some people who are joyful in their senior years, there are other seniors who are maybe a little bit more cynical about the fact that, their day is coming to meet the Lord.
Yep.
And where you are is not about just sitting and waiting to meet the Lord. It's like God has a purpose for your life, for every moment that you're here.
Right.
And that none of it should be wasted. The Crosses are doing that, obviously.
Yes.
How do you convey that to people who are watching tonight?
We try to convey it in a number of ways, but most importantly, we realize, as I've said before, you can retire from a career, but you don't retire from a calling. Yeah. And you heard that Barbara and David felt called to the mission field, and then once they raised their children, they felt called again, but they both together said there needs to be a specific call. God works that way. Yeah. And here at Quarryville, we go where neighbors become friends and friends become family. And as people age, they lose their family, they lose their friends, they get new ones. And they're often those drawn around the fact that they're passionate about proclaiming God's might and power to the next generation. And so we encourage that. We give them the freedom. There's prayer. There's other things that they can use their gifts even as we age. We can't maybe do it as strongly as we'd hope to, but our hearts are focused on doing the things that are eternal. And they are living that out now in Quarryville, having done it in Australia, done it here in the United States, in Carlisle, and then in Britain. And so we encourage that. And they're encouraging, as they make friends, they get to hear their story, the story that they just shared with you, and others are encouraged, and they go, well, maybe I could do that. They join in a Bible study, they join in a prayer group, or they write letters, or they reach out to the local high school students. Each of those are a way that they can invest and still press on and share their stories of how God's hand directed them.
Yeah, and for some of us, we get to be grandparents too,
Yes.
which is kind of neat, right?
And that's
right, Grandpa?
Oh, thanks.
Granddad.
Granddad.
Your
yeah.
granddad.
They're your grandpa.
Yeah.
No, it's a blessing to be able to invest in the next generation. And that's what a number of our residents are doing as well. Because they just realize the story that Christ loves us and wants us to love others can be repeated time and time again. And it takes a while for us sometimes to sink in. Yeah. And as Barbara shared, we don't think about God at all? Well, maybe you should.
Yeah. Wasn't that powerful?
Well said. Yeah. And just a joy to have them together because they're engaging other residents and then people outside the community. They're drawing in to say, look what you could richly trust in. Trust in the Lord, and all the say, always be that way.
Amen. Well, maybe this conversation spoke directly to you. Maybe it's time for you to sketch out a mission for the next lap of your life, however long or short God has for you. Our thanks to Robert for being on the show and introducing us to David and Barbara. I'll be back with Jeff Coleman for closing thoughts.
You're watching Joe Watkins' State of Independence on Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Share your comments about today's program in the comment box at joewatkins.org.
And now let's talk to our great producer, Jeff Coleman.
Well, I hope this is a helpful show. I think it is, especially for people who may have said, I'm done, I'm finished, I'm relaxing and I've earned my rest. But this notion that Robert develops every time he comes onto the program, which is that your calling extends to the day God calls you home. And the circumstances can change, where you live, who your neighbors are, who your family and support structure is. But you see a couple like the Crosses thrive in a generation of life because they have a mission. They're waking up in the morning saying, who can I love? Who can I serve? Is it the hairdresser? But this notion that Barbara said, which was that her heroes from a very early age, 4 up, were missionaries. And that was my case. I mean, my parents ended up being missionaries, and the people that I remember growing up, earliest memories were people sharing missionary stories of lives given away to other people.
Were you surprised by what Barbara said when she said that in England, the folks were said something to the effect of, we don't even think about God?
I think that's a reality that we face here. We just don't say it the same way. We may acknowledge the existence of a God, and American pollsters may pick up that heartbeat. They say, yeah, sure. There's probably some spiritual force or reason. We had the Barna Group on a few episodes ago talking about people have a spiritual hunger and a desire. But when it comes to living a life saying, I give up, I'm surrendered to whatever God's will is, I think that's where Americans and folks in Britain and everywhere around the world, we have a tough time giving up control of our lives to put meaning behind in God we trust.
Yeah. What a small percentage then of people who actually follow Jesus.
Yeah. Plenty of people believe in God. Plenty of people, as you say often, attend church, but to give your whole life to someone else, to say, you do with me what you want to do, take me anywhere, I'm in. That's the message that the Crosses had, and that's a message that we try to proclaim on this program.
Amen, brother. Amen. That's a good word. It's a good word. Well, maybe you think you're too old to live like David and Barbara. Maybe you feel like God was through with you when you made that last big mistake. Here's what I know. No one, especially you, is beyond hope or out of God's reach. You can trust Him. His plan for you is better than anything you could have ever hoped for or imagined. Drop me a note in the comment box at joewatkins.org. I read and respond to each one of them. And for Jeff Coleman and the entire production team at Lighthouse TV, thanks so much for welcoming us into your home. From America's first capital, Philadelphia, I'm Joe Watkins. God willing, I'll see you next week. Great that God would use the Crosses that way, and that they'd be so faithful to go to Australia, to go to England.
And to be at the point in life where they finish each other's sentences.
Yeah.
Really? Joe Watkins' State of Independence is a production of Lighthouse TV, positively different. Made possible in part because of the support of viewers like you.